Hello everyone, I'm Shirley, GovInsider Senior Reporter, and welcome to our webinar on unlocking analytics and AI for data-driven healthcare. Thank you for spending your morning with us today. We do have a wonderful program lined up, and we'll be hearing from some of the region's leading experts on the shifting tides of healthcare and the tools that can bring us forward. Thank you so much to our partners at Cloudera for making this possible. So without further ado, let me introduce our superstar speakers today. We have Schrader, Program Director of the Virtual Care Accelerator at eHealth New South Wales. We have Dr. Yuan. He's the Group Chief Technology Officer at the National University Health System of Singapore. We have Professor Thomas Liu, Group Chief Data and Strategy Officer of Singapore's National Healthcare Group. We have Praveen Deorani, Senior Data Scientist at Singapore's MOH Office for Healthcare Transformation. And we have Maike, Vice President of Industry Solutions and Value Management at Cloudera. Warm welcome to all of our speakers, and thank you so much for joining us today. So we're going to kickstart today's session by learning about New South Wales' journey on remote monitoring and virtual healthcare. I'd like to bring on Schrader, Program Director of the Virtual Care Accelerator, to share more. Ian, take it away.
Thank you very much. And unusual times for me. I just introduced myself, Ian Schrader, as I said, Program Director for our Virtual Care Accelerator, which we've been running in New South Wales, Australia for the last 18 months. And I unfortunately speak to you from my car today. As of 20 minutes ago, my internet in our suburb failed. So I've had to take alternative precautions to get this video too. So I hope you'll bear with me. I'm representing a program that many facets of the state have been running, and my job has been to bring all that together so that we've been going in the right direction as a state system, as a way of accelerating, as it were, what we've been doing around virtual care and telehealth. We'll just go to the next slide. Okay, and a bit of a background I want to talk to you about today. Bit of a background as to what we've been doing in New South Wales. What is remote patient monitoring to us? Our approach within New South Wales Health, where we are focusing, where we have been focusing, also some lessons learned, and I'll top it off with a patient story at the end. Happy to move to the next slide. Okay, as I said before, New South Wales Health has many different areas that are working on remote patient monitoring. And we've actually been doing this for a good number of years now in pockets of goodness throughout the state. Probably about 3 to 5 years we've been running different versions of remote patient monitoring, from cardiac rehabilitation and the like. And more recently, in these times, COVID-19 pandemic, we've been utilising virtual care and in particular remote monitoring for looking after patients while they've been isolating at home. And also from what we've been doing for the last 18 months, we've been utilising that, as I said before, to transform our direction as a health system. And I'm pleased to say that remote patient monitoring and virtual care is here to stay. Our patients and the public are telling us that what we've been doing they've liked and they want more to see of this. And we're fronting a myriad of our hospital systems, specialty health networks and local health districts in our journey forward. And the next couple of months we'll produce a virtual care strategy as well, which will be made public. Next slide, please. Okay, remote monitoring. So essentially this to us is treating patients remotely, looking at biometric information from monitoring devices, having that transported to the likes of dashboards that clinicians can have a look at. So from a COVID-19 perspective, having a look at blood oxygen saturation levels and further, depending on what sort of specialty we are looking at. We also working with patients and making sure that patients are a part of this journey as well. So mobile phone applications where they can also have a look at the data and also having a look at instructions from clinicians and being able to communicate directly with clinicians. Next slide, please. Okay, but this is not a fixed program. It is very much a journey, and we are taking a lot of inputs around the challenges that we're trying to solve, safety aspects, what our experience measures are telling us, and also all the feedback from the community. So what are the good parts? What are the bad parts? What are the concerning parts? And what do they want more of? There's definitely more opportunities, and as I said, evolving. So there's new technologies and new capabilities coming online on a monthly perspective. What we were doing back in January is already different from what we're doing at the moment. And a key piece is how do we get all this data? How do we harmonise that and get that in so that clinicians can have a look at that all in one place? Next slide, please. Okay, focus areas. So I mentioned COVID-19, so treating patients remotely, but also rehabilitation. So the number of months for those that have contracted COVID-19, how do they rehabilitate over the next couple of months? Cardiac rehab, diabetes, these are tried and tested care modalities that have been around for a couple of years. COP-D, we're also advancing in wound care activities, and those medication areas such as treating of tuberculosis and also medication therapy for clozapine. Next slide, please. So what have we found? So this is an evolving space. The market is changing quite substantially. We're making sure that we're engaging with our consumers. So we have steering committees, and also we're running a task force at the moment. And we have consumer representation on each of those. So both clinician and consumer representation, and not just one, but we have quite a few consumers representing the public on the work that we're doing. We're also concerned around some issues around technology inequalities, socioeconomic inequalities, the haves-nots. Also, the tyranny of distance in New South Wales is quite substantial. So on the East Coast, we're quite blessed to have technology and good bandwidth, but as you go further west, it's a lot harder to get those technologies. And even just mobile phone, it can be a little bit hit and miss. So how do we bring that level of care to those patients without reducing their care because of these barriers? We'll move to next slide, please. So there's more to achieve from here onwards. So some of the challenges that we're working through are our ongoing funding models. So how do we make sure that we stabilise these activities? These can cost quite a bit. So how do we, as I said, get our funding models from an Australia-wide perspective and state perspective so that we can continue these great aspects of healthcare? Making sure that our different types of healthcare within the country, so within our hospital system in New South Wales, that's our secondary care. We also have our general practitioners in our primary care solution. And all of these different areas treat patients in different ways, and how do we bring them all together so we have continuity of care? We also want to make sure we have standards in place. So when we do something, it's the same look and feel and expectations to clinicians as well as patients. And we want to continue strengthening our consumer engagement activities as well. Next slide, please. So, and I'll finish up. So here's a nice case study. So this is a great example of advancements in healthcare. And this is for what we call our far west local health district. So this is our most distant district throughout New South Wales. And this particular patient has a chronic condition and has been treated at home. And some of the benefits of this treatment means that she isn't travelling away from her home to receive day-to-day care. So she's able to be treated at home and looked after, and look at those vital signs whenever she changes her medications and the like. And also having a look at those signs, able to intervene more rapidly and stabilise where things might be going awry, and only have her transported into hospital care, or you know, maybe 1,000 miles to the Sydney hospitals when it's absolutely necessary. So some more of the benefits, it gives the level of comfort for patients like these to be able to treat themselves and look after their care at home. and also opens up that collaboration between clinicians and patients. So they are both responsible for their level of healthcare. So I'd like to just finish up with a quote. I felt like I had all the support I needed and a great health team. It was reassuring to have my readings monitored after a medication change. And I'll leave you with that. Thanks for listening. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Ian. And it's really wonderful to see how New South Wales is using remote care to monitor citizens with chronic diseases. I'm looking forward to hear more during our panel later. So before we head into our next keynote, I do have a poll question for all of our audience members. So I think the poll question should appear on your screen in just a moment. Okay, so our first poll question for today is, what are the top data challenges you face in your organization today? And you can choose as many that apply. So our options are the rate of data growth, integrating different data sources, or perhaps you're looking into security and governance today, generating timely insights, or maybe even migrating to the cloud, managing a hybrid environment, or even managing multiple clouds. So I'm going to give everyone a few moments to cast their votes. Okay. Wow. So I can see that integrating different data sources and security is quite a close fight, about 80% for both. So I'd like to bring Cindy on to actually give her keynote and also to share any advice she may have. She's Cloudera's Vice President of Industry Solutions and Value Management. So Cindy, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Shirley. And just I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Greatly appreciate the opportunity. So I'm going to build upon kind of the topics that Ian was talking about, and also just to give you a little bit of perspective on where Cloudera is in the healthcare industry. For those of you that may not be familiar with Cloudera, we're actually an enterprise data cloud organization. What that actually means is we're helping organizations bring together any and all type of data. So building upon some of those polling questions is, how do we deal with integrating various different types of data sources, bringing that data together in a secure and governed fashion? So we have the capabilities that allow you to deal with any and all type of data, whether it be real-time streaming type information, whether it's coming from healthcare devices, or it might actually be bringing in sensor information coming in from the clinics, to also dealing with your electronic healthcare records, and allowing that data to be either on-prem in your own organizational infrastructure, or whether it be in the cloud, a public cloud, a private cloud, or a combination of any of those. So really thinking about that from a hybrid perspective. We're a global organization working with healthcare providers, both in the payer, the provider, the biopharma, the biomed industry, as well as the med tech device industry across the world. Just within that, I think I want to go into building upon just a slightly different perspective as well, is we've got the telehealth, but also thinking about that entire digital care journey. So if you think about what's happened since the pandemic and how people are sourcing and getting information. Interesting enough, Google has seen quite a surge in the number of consumers that are actually asking medical questions. Where are we getting information? How are we actually researching? How do we also make sure that when we're interacting from a telehealth perspective, what type of data sources organizations are doing? We're also looking at how do we take action on that real-time information? How do we make sure that we're getting the right data? Organizations and people are also doing additional searches, getting their own information prior to actually seeking care itself. So I think as we move forward and as we start to come out of the pandemic, I think we think every day we're going to be coming out of the pandemic and so forth. But the other aspect is, the pandemic has really kind of forced us to rethink about both from an insurance company perspective, as well as from a provider perspective, where we're starting to see the convergence, and as Ian was talking about, the telehealth side. We're bringing together both that virtual and that physical perspective. How do we bring together those different types of data sources? And this data points from Forrester are also quite interesting that, healthcare is really the area of where we've seen such transformation, and the pandemic has really brought about what was previously in some parts of the world. Telehealth was not an acceptable method of practice. Insurance companies weren't actually paying for certain types of claims related to telehealth. Now it's become our practice of how do we administer some of our healthcare? How do we also look to integrate that data? But then also, as we start to get organizations and businesses back into reopening offices, how do we actually possibly use telehealth and bringing in additional types of data to help us safeguard employees? What type of information do we need to collect about, actual physical properties about individuals? And I think it really is kind of making us see that, every company as we move forward has some type of healthcare responsibility. So as we look at that, I think another aspect is, there's all different types of data sources, and how do we bring together data across the healthcare ecosystem? Whether it's, information from telehealth, from patient, from wearables, from, the physical devices. We might actually be needing to bring in, the actual patient healthcare record. We may also want to bring in data that's coming from our government agencies, and also bringing in research information coming in from clinicians. So lots of different data, lots of interconnectivity of those data sources, the need for sharing of information, transferring information, bringing things across, different types of 5G networks in order to make sure that data is properly connected and it's also not compromised. So the security, the governance, and understanding who's done what with what data is quite important. So we have the opportunity, I'll go ahead and build this out, to see lots of different use cases, whether it's patient care, to also predictive analytics, to looking at precision medicine, the research side. But really today, I want to focus a little bit more on the health IoT, the elements of looking at that telehealth, what type of information is needed. How do you make sure that we get that information in? How do we link that data along with other data sources that we need in order to do a holistic view for the patient, either at the bedside, in that digital environment, to actually look at, leveraging predictive analytics and also AI as well. So providing some recommendations from a telehealth perspective. So one of the things, and Ian was talking about, is the wearable aspects. And Cloudera, with our platform, we have the ability through our Cloudera data flow to bring in and ingest data from wearable devices, whether it's, an actual, maybe a scale that a person is using. It's a diabetic monitoring, your glucose monitoring. It may also be something that's monitoring your pulse, your temperature, those types of information, along with other data sources within your home. Possibly, what are the conditions, the air quality, those information coming in as well. Bringing and joining that data also with maybe it's your EHR. You might actually be looking at your lab information. Also maybe prior conversations, your call center, your clinician notes. And then also being able to leverage that data to help with more predictive modeling, being able to use artificial intelligence, and then also even look at your reporting capabilities. So we're doing that in a secure, governed fashion within our shared data experience, which provides the data governance, the security, and the data lineage, so we can understand who's done what with what data and who's joined what data and where's that data actually residing, whether it's on the cloud or on your own internal infrastructure. So just a couple of case studies that have been since the pandemic. This is a representation from a US hospital, Rush Medical, who was actually bringing in real-time patient information, blending that data with their EHR information, EMR data, looking at ingesting that, being able to provide for quicker diagnosis of patient care, and also being able to reduce the processing times. And in addition to that, they were also using the same type of information to actually help them understand the supply chain availability of PPE equipment within the hospital system. And then one other case study coming out of South Africa is an organization, Discovery Limited, who's been using the capabilities from wearable information, as well as interacting with some of their patients that had a higher risk factor for contacting COVID, being able to do that patient care monitoring and sending out information to the patients on, if they were at risk or if they've been exposed. And then just one last thing, where are we helping organizations with the ability to bring in value-based healthcare, helping organizations reduce IT expense, as well as also looking at the compliance aspects of security and governance. And on that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Shirley.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Cindy, for that exciting presentation. There's so much to be excited about on the potential of analytics in healthcare. So before we dive into our panel discussion, I'm going to quickly bring everyone through our second poll question of the day. We'd like to find out what you're looking forward to seeing in the next stage of healthcare. So our options are new opportunities for AI to power personalized predictive care. Are you looking forward to the future of remote care and telehealth, which Ian has shared so much about? Or are you looking forward to leveraging new and existing data sources for better decision-making and quicker patient diagnosis? Or are you looking to integrate healthcare across multiple systems and providers? Okay, a very close fight once again. So we can see that AI and leveraging data and also integrating healthcare is have about equal percentages in this poll. So I know that that's exactly what we'll be discussing during our panel. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from our panelists. So if I could bring up all of our panelists for today. Just a note to our audience members, Dr. Ngiam won't be able to join us for the full duration of the event, but he has kindly agreed to take any questions over email. So do still submit your questions to all of our panelists, and please tell us who you would like to direct your question to. And do include your contact details just in case we can't get to your question today. Okay, we're gonna kickstart right now. So let's first begin by looking into virtual care, which we've seen a realm of opportunities emerge in the last 18 months or so. And Dr. Ngiam, I'm going to turn my first question to you today. How did virtual care actually change during the pandemic? And what kind of data and analytics were helpful in that pivot?
Thank you, Shirley, and thanks for the organizers for inviting. I think, as we all know, that virtual care has become the norm in the pandemic era. There was a joke that 2 years ago, what's the most effective way to get people on telemedicine and virtual care? Is it, CEO or CTO or CIO or COVID, right? So I can share that before the pandemic, it was really hard to get people onto virtual care, and we couldn't convince enough people to come on board. But the pandemic kind of forced everyone to adopt virtual care as a norm. But that said, despite the best efforts, I would say that the maximum that we could get was about 20 to 25% of people to go into virtual care. And that tells you a story about healthcare, right? So healthcare, it's a high touch industry. It's not something that you can automate and you put in a pipeline and everything will just work nicely, right? Because every patient is slightly different and their needs are different. So I'm not sure if it's just in Singapore, but I believe that it's going to be true to the rest of the world, where you're going to have a large proportion of people still requiring physical care. And what you're actually doing is moving some of their care components to the virtual space so that they don't have the inconvenience of coming to hospital care settings. And I also want to emphasize that virtual care doesn't actually reduce the amount of physician time that is spent. So all these insights came from the fact that we could track some of these virtual care consults over the last 2 years. And we've seen a trend, right, which is that though virtual care adoption was high in the initial parts of the pandemic, but as it wore on, we found that the number of people adopting, or percentage of people adopting virtual care was actually dropping, not increasing. I think that represents an opportunity because we now have a willing mindset to take up virtual care. Then the question is, can we extend the same level of care that we provide in the hospital to patients at home? And earlier, Ian has shared some examples of how you could do remote monitoring and remote care effectively. And I think that those things are things that we can do fairly well right now. And there's certainly an opportunity and an ability to improve on that going forwards, especially with better monitors, more integrated sensors. And of course, with that, hopefully the cost comes down so that we can transact real virtual care and hopefully increase the proportion of patients who want to be on virtual care to accept that at home. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Ngiam. Ian, I'm going to turn to you next. Dr. Ngiam actually mentioned quite a few considerations like maintaining the human touch, cost, and also just ensuring that the level of care is the same. So Ian, I want to find out what are some important considerations, as virtual care is actually optimized throughout New South Wales and Australia as a whole. What are you looking at?
Yeah, a good question, and I concur with the statements that were just made. I think in New South Wales, and I'd say across Australia, we're finding similar to the uptake during our first wave last year was high, then it did taper off again. It actually dropped off. We're finding it has, because we're going through another period at the moment, and that has increased again. So some of the areas that we're finding highly important is that consultation with the community, making sure that we bring the public along, that we're addressing the right activities. Rather than just taking products off the shelf, we're making sure that we're going through a co-design, human-centered design type process, making sure that the tools are built correctly for clinicians and the usability for our patients and carers and the community as a whole are right there. Also, something that was mentioned as well was integration of all the data. So integrating our remote patient monitoring systems. So there's a lot of data that comes out of that. Do we keep that separate? We have all our data and reports in our electronic medical record systems, so making sure they're integrated. So there's quite a few areas. And so what we're doing is trying to not solve all the problems at once. We're trying to make sure that we get those key foundations right and focus on the things that we can do well and then start to build on those.
Definitely. Thanks so much for that, Ian. And Professor Liu, I'm going to turn to you next. So Ian actually talked about leveraging data, and we saw that was something that a lot of our audience members are excited about. So I want to find out how NHG is actually using analytics, algorithms, and data applications to actually prepare for this paradigm shift towards remote care.
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. Yes, thanks again for this invitation. I thought that listening to Dr. Ngiam and listening to Ian, we do realize that Singapore is uniquely compact in that sense as a dense city with a very, very high digital adoption. Actually, the idea that digital care is by no means remote. It is in fact competing with physical care. And in that sense, the value proposition, right, of our individuals moving into the digital space versus that convenience of popping up at the clinic or at the hospital is in fact that constant battle that we fight. I think COVID, of course, created restrictions, and that created the segue for adoption. We, in fact, found that our primary care teleconsults ballooned by 40 times. So at the peak of COVID, we were in fact looking after. We had about 40,000 teleconsults at the peak of COVID per month. And what we found is that the end-to-end processes is as important, if not more important, than the consult itself. The delivery of medication, the ability to assess a pharmacist or a nurse for counseling immediately after a consult, the ability to conduct tests in the location near individuals, and then the opportunity for biometric biosensing follow-up. And I think this tells us that it was an iterative process in terms of incremental improvement. Of course, analytics also helped us determine some of the patients who are accepting of this process and who will be most likely to have that capability, including caregiver profiles that would allow them to assess this modality. And of course, closer to where COVID is impacting on us, I think we have had the opportunity to use analytics to risk stratify our patients in order to right-site them in the correct facilities for safety and appropriate level of care. And our command control communication systems allowed for that flow of patients through the system, which even now I think we are working very hard to ensure that quality of care resides throughout that continuum. But I think the next stage of population health and the use of digital care is really one where the easy goal, I think, is to combine the virtual with the physical and to enhance the patient's journey. And I think from that point of view, transactions is a very low-hanging fruit for ensuring an increased availability and seamlessness of that journey. But the population that we now need to assess in the next stage of population health are those who are well, who do not traditionally access healthcare. And you could say that they are health naive, because health facility naive. And I think there is a great opportunity here to go straight to study exactly what motivates the people to keep themselves well. What are the behavior modifiers that will enable them to maintain their health, even if they don't feel as though it is a matter of urgency? And then the question comes about trust, about relationship, about their ability to activate themselves. And I think what we are trying to do in NHG is to establish a level of customization, use innovation, including gamification, in order to draw out, right, that personal motivation, that interest, the biofeedback that people rely on. And last but not least, I think we grapple with perhaps the level of cynicism and fear of manipulation, I think, that resides in the digital space today, and how we as a trusted provider will need to manage that relationship in that kind of environment. And I think I stopped there because I've learned a lot really from the other speakers, and perhaps there will be other comments in this area. Thank you, Shirley.
Thank you so much, Professor Liu. And I do see quite a few questions coming in from the audience, so I'm going to address one of them to Cindy. So we do have a question on how we can make virtual care more accessible to those of the lower SES and also the elderly. So that is also something that Ian touched on earlier. So Cindy, I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a key topic because of the fact, if we think about the different types of wearable type information that patients can have, and especially for the elderly and so forth, the ability to actually receive healthcare in their home. Many are actually getting more acclimated to digital technology now, as opposed to having to now I have to get out. So it actually goes to more of a quality of life, taking advantage of the digital phones that they have or iPads, and actually it makes it easier for them to also think about wearable devices. I actually, it's been probably 7-8 years ago, I was working on a project for remote patient monitoring for congestive heart failure with elderly patients that were going home. And so how do we actually reduce the amount of hospital readmittance rates? And it was dealing with the elderly population who wanted to go home, to be in their home, and getting them comfortable. So I think it's taking advantage of the technology that we have in our homes today, whether it be an iPad, an iPhone, or even a wearable watch, leveraging that technology and then taking that data, and also just making sure that they feel comfortable with the technology.
Yeah, definitely. Ian or any of our panelists, could you share your thoughts on this as well? What can we do to actually make remote care accessible to the entire population?
So I can have a quick go at that, Ian here. So we're obviously grappling with that as well. So how do you make technology more accessible, but also things like internet, making sure everybody has internet. So I probably don't have the magical answer, but we do often loan devices to those that can't afford them. There's obviously patients who are well able to provide their own and prefer to use their own. So that allows us to concentrate resources on the pools of devices. Obviously, we have all the making sure that devices are all cleaned appropriately before they go out. Some devices are also disposable. So it depends on what areas we're focusing on there, but I'll probably answer that one with within our country. With distance, probably internet is a bit of a challenge at the moment. We're looking at what we can do with subsidising internet for those with chronic conditions and the like. There's probably some areas of focus as well.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Thanks so much for sharing, Ian. And okay, I'm going to turn our conversation towards the tools and technologies that are actually powering this shift in healthcare. So Professor Ngiam, if I could turn to you once again, what have actually been the biggest lessons from NUHS's use of AI and the cloud for personalized healthcare?
Oh, thanks for that question, Shirley. We've spent a number of years developing AI tools, and I think the biggest lesson we have to learn is that you have to build platforms that allow AI to scale, right? If you look at different countries in the world, they all have different ways of approaching AI. Some look at it from a project to project perspective. That means, they onboard specific AI tools for radiology, specific AI tools for predicting heart disease, and so on and so forth. That's great. I think that's a good way to get started. But if you really want to scale up AI and really realize AI's potential at the population level, you have to build scalable cloud-based platforms that allow you to scale up from 1 to 100 AI tools in a very short period of time. There's no space in this for legacy systems that requires ETL. The platforms have to be stream capable so that your AI tools can function in real time. So that's a key kind of takeaway, right? I can talk a lot about the different AI tools that we've built, and as well as onboarding AI tools that others have built. But the impact of these AI tools would be very limited if you could only apply it to a very small group of patients, right? So imagine if you had a readmissions predictor and you apply it to one ward or one group of patients. Yes, you could predict readmissions within that group of patients, but the impact would be very, very limited, right? So if you could imagine that you apply it across the entire population, the impact will be tremendous, right? Because not only readmissions predictors are a good indicator of readmissions, they are actually a good indicator of ill health, right? So if you could then scale up your AI tools by being able to feed in population-sized data, you're going to get outsized benefits, not just from a real clinical perspective, but from a developmental perspective. Thank you.
Right, thanks so much for that, Dr. Ngiam. And I do see quite a few questions coming in as well on how we can actually make AI tools and data accessible to the clinicians to actually encourage them to adopt these tools. So Praveen, I'm actually going to turn to you on that, and to the rest of our panelists, if you have anything to add, you can add it after Praveen. Yeah. So Praveen, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is that in healthcare and in some of the industries in general, that we are not very comfortable using technology, and especially it makes sense, especially because we are dealing with patient lives, with patient health, and so on. And it may be a little difficult to believe that a computer can do the job of a clinician, which is true, of course. I mean, even in next probably 20, 30 years, we won't see computers able to do what a clinician can do. Because as has been discussed in the panel before, every patient is slightly different with slightly different needs. There are so many diseases types, they all interact with each other, they are related to each other in some ways. But the way AI should be really used in healthcare is not in replacing or trying to do the difficult things, but instead trying to do the more routine things. So for example, there is some adoption, limited, but there is some adoption in diagnostic imaging. You may have, for example, a lot of MRI images of the heart, slicing through the heart. There's so many images, and a radiologist could do that, but it would take half an hour for getting parameters of the organ system that you're talking about. But a computer can do it in a few seconds, and the radiologist can just verify it within a minute, right? That's one example. The other example could be, for example, as an assistant in taking the notes. There was some research published a few years ago which showed that about half of the time of the clinician is spent in taking the notes or looking at the screen, the data of the past lab test of the patients and so on. Now that part could be done by smart tools. For example, when the patient and the clinicians are having a conversation about what's going on, you could imagine there may be a speech recognition system which could automatically translate this conversation into text. Now that's a bit hard because unlike your Google Assistant, for example, in this conversation there may be a lot of medical terminology which is usually the AI systems are not trained on corpus that is specific to medical language, but that can be done. And so those are the kind of tools, AI tools that you would like to be used in the healthcare system. And if you could convince the clinician, one of the most common concerns from the clinicians is that how can a computer be, how can we leave it to the computer to decide? But that's what we are saying. We shouldn't do the job of the clinician. We should only try to be an assistant to the clinician. They shouldn't be spending 50% of their time on the screen, and that's where AI can help. And I think that's how, if we build tools with that mindset, it should be possible to lead to a wider adoption.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for that, Praveen. Panelists, does anyone have anything to add on that? How can we make AI tools accessible to our clinicians?
Yeah, maybe I can say something as a clinician. Well, like I mentioned in the chat, ideally for clinicians, we don't ever want to know that an AI tool needs to be clicked on or activated. It should be automated, right? That's the idea. Technology is supposed to help us, not make our work harder, right? Imagine if you added to a clinician's workload by, making them do more clicks or do a certain number of note entries so that they can fulfill an AI function. That would be actually regressing rather than progressing, right? And of course, in terms of adoption, as clinicians, we are driven by a evidence-based approach. No AI tool should be accepted to be a standard of care unless it passes the test of evidence, as with all other medical devices and all other kinds of scoring systems that are currently being used by clinicians. Indeed, I would say that clinicians are not always adverse to AI tools. It's just a matter of them understanding what is the level of evidence required to use that information for patient care. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Dr. Ngiam. Okay, I'm going to turn our conversation to integrated care, which I believe a lot of healthcare providers are actually looking at to extend healthcare beyond the hospital and into the communities. Yeah, so Professor Liu, I'd like to turn this question to you actually. How can we integrate this healthcare without actually infringing on any data privacy issues that a lot of patients may be actually concerned about?
Yeah, thanks, Shirley. Yeah, and I also note the earlier question by Emma, which is very relevant to this topic. So I think firstly, this idea of us as healthcare providers having a relationship with a patient is a well developed one over the years, and it really is a kind of a compact that we have with a patient in which we, in return for respecting the patient's wishes, the patient's desired health care outcome, we offer care with the proviso that we have access to their information. So it forms part of a broader system of relationship in which these consent, right, is packaged into the care. It is slightly different when we cross that the relationship between provider and patient to one where we are impacting the social care, the social scenario. And this idea of health and social, I think, will always be one where we need to evaluate our right to access information based on appropriate needs and our ability to justify those appropriate needs. And I think part of the compelling value proposition is this idea that if we have a single source of truth, if we have a single care plan for which a variety of providers, be it health or social, are able to then collaborate together in order to improve the outcome of an individual, then would the individual grant us the level of consent that we are used to in a patient-physician relationship in order to ensure the outcome is met. So I think firstly, there has to be that level of transparency. There has to be that level of consent, which shouldn't be deemed or shouldn't be implied, but should be explicit. And lastly, I think there has to be that ability to be very specific about what we are trying to help that individual. Now, the next point is that it is probably not necessary to have a single source of truth. As you broaden, in my mind, the ecosystem in which an individual and his identity exists in society, there cannot be a single source of truth. There are different ways of defining that person, the personhood, and how he or she contributes or benefit from society in different dimensions. And I think we will need to live with a system where we are working together across different domains to share information. And so we need to share information with the idea that we are accountable, that with the idea that we have responsibility to ensure privacy and safety, and that we have consent. And I think within that context, right, we will be able to navigate this broader system. Last but not least, I think the question is why? Why do this, right? And so it comes with leverage. I think in Singapore, health is very well funded for the purpose that it has been to keep our patients healthy. But increasingly, we need to move from a healthcare model to a wellness model. And in the wellness space, the leverage for population health and how we fund a resident's journey through capitation, for example, will become a key driver in what elements of that individual's lives we should assess his or her information in order to enhance their health. So I put together a few conceptual ideas about how to overcome privacy as well as the health and social divide. Hopefully that's helpful, and really looking to hear also perhaps from Yuan and Cindy in terms of what other societal requirements are for broader access to healthcare information. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Professor Liu. Yuan, would you like to go ahead? I see you have unmuted yourself.
Yeah, so that raises a good point. And I was going to look for an opportunity to talk to this later on, but we've got in New South Wales a lot of, and I hear this from all the other speakers, so this is obviously not something we are doing differently, but we are taking very much an evidence approach here. So we have a very strong monitoring evaluation program that's running alongside what we are doing, very much a strong safety aspect of what we're pushing forward as well, which has the balance of obviously safety and putting our funds in the right areas. It also does, I guess, pace what we are doing. So we're not putting a lot of energy in multiple areas. We're looking at evidence from obviously your region in Singapore and other areas. Where is the evidence? Where's the good levels of outcomes that we're trying to put our efforts into? So just that's the point I wanted to make about just making sure that we are focused in those areas.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much for sharing, Ian. Cindy, I wanted to turn to you. What are your thoughts on this, actually?
Yeah, and I think, when it comes to data security and data privacy, we've got to look at other techniques that are out there rather than just, encryption and so forth, which is typically more the traditional approaches. But how do we actually use data anonymization and tokenization, where we can actually strip out some of those key fields that are really kind of our PHI or PII data, and bring and combine the data sources that we need from a data science and AI and analysis perspective, where it removes the individualization, but you can still do your analytics and then take the information once you've done the analysis and take it back, and then you can get it back to an individual record again. So you can look at data collectively, but still in a private fashion. So there are newer techniques that we can all use versus maybe some of our traditional analytical methods that we've used in the past. And I think companies, and the one Discovery Limited, that was a specific use case that they needed to do. The tokenization and the anonymization of data was so critical to them.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cindy. And thank you so much to all panelists for answering this question. Definitely data privacy is something that we do want to look at as we integrate healthcare across multiple providers, because that would obviously involve a lot of data sharing. And yeah, so I'm going to quickly round up today's discussion, given that we have just a few more minutes left. So to our audience members who have submitted your questions, do let us know if you'd like to answer them over email. So do leave your contact details down if you like us to do so. Yeah. So, okay, Ian, I'm going to turn to you as we wrap up today's discussion. What are some evolving models of healthcare you are looking forward to seeing?
Oh, gee, there's many to choose from. As I mentioned, we're being very data focused on what we're looking at. A couple of areas that we've been looking at over the last, say, 2 to 3 years, which require more expansion. We didn't have a great telestroke type capability in our state, and the level of negative outcomes were quite high. We've now implemented quite a strong program of utilising technology around the use of telestroke, and over quite a short rollout period, we're actually getting some great outcomes for our patients. Lots of good news stories are coming through our newspapers of where situations would have normally turned dire, and we've had great recovery with almost no level of recovery required. Hospital in the home is another one that we're quite keen on. Admitted hospital care, but outside the hospital space. How do we treat our patients there, together also with our outpatient work? So, and as also mentioned earlier, moving from the centric hospital approach to very much the public health wellness arena. How do we keep patients, or put patients more in charge of their healthcare, educating them well, getting them to determine when they should seek advice best, and also providing more access to to different types of, I guess, knowledge bases and clinicians in different settings. So, but that hospital in the home arena looks like it's going to be quite interesting going forward.
Definitely. Thanks so much for sharing that, Ian. Praveen, I want to turn my question to you next. What are some AI and analytics innovations that you feel will power the next frontier of healthcare?
Yeah, so we are already seeing some usage of AI in diagnostic imaging. That's the most widely adopted, although still not very widely adopted. I mean, the role of such tools is limited so far. But we can expect to see wider adoption in very near future because as the large and larger amount of data gets digitized, we could build tools based on those data driven insights to actually deliver precision medicine. So for example, you could have personalized prescriptions on lifestyle changes, on medication and so on, using these tools, right? So what I mean is, if most of the patients are quite complex, they have a lot of diseases, they must lose weight, they must take their medicines, they must stop smoking, they must control their glucose and so on. But what is the one thing that you should start with, for example? So at MOST, we have built such a tool using data and predictive models, and what it does is it gives you personalized impact of these risk factors. And what it really does is, of course, in the end, the patient must control all of the things, the weight and the glucose and the LDL, everything. But where should they start with? Because if you tell them to improve everything at the same time, it may get quite overwhelming. So that personalized insight for each individual patient based on these AI tools, for example, is quite powerful. And we may see wider adoption of such clinical decision support, or you could say clinician-patient decision sharing tools in the future. But there are, you could also optimize public health programs, outreaching to which kind of patient should you reach out to different for different intervention programs. But you could also think about applications beyond healthcare settings or beyond healthcare providers and clinics. So for example, pharma companies, they are using this data-driven insights, real-world evidence for repurposing existing drugs. They can also use data of past randomized control trials to detect the irregularities in the research and finding out where the placebo effect is higher and so on, to optimize these RCTs really, so that you could find better signal of the new drugs that are in the pipeline, and thus the development of these drugs can become a lot more efficient, a lot more cost effective. And related to that, further down the line is also drug discovery using protein folding. One of the very difficult problems in the past in molecular biology has been understanding the structure of the protein. But recently, AI tools have made significant progress in understanding that. And if we can crack it, it could really accelerate our understanding of the pathology of the disease at the molecular level, and it could again make the drug discovery a lot more efficient. And then one more thing that I'd like to say is genetics. Well, 30% of our outcomes, depending on what outcomes you look at, is determined by our genes. But the genes are so big, the signal is so complex in the genes, and it's been very difficult to understand. Sure, we have made some progress in some of the areas. We understand cancer, for example, much better than we did 15 years ago. We also understand some of the rare genetic disorders and so on. But there's a lot more in the horizon, and as genome sequencing is becoming cheaper and cheaper, we have access to more and more data. These algorithms pass through more and more data. You could imagine predictive modeling tools which could help us to understand our genetic predisposition to various diseases and various outcomes, and based on that, we may be able to make optimal decisions about our lifestyle and the choices of medication and other interventions. So yeah, these are some of the things that I would say are the potential applications in near and far future, and quite exciting to look forward to.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Praveen. And Thomas and Cindy, I do want to get some final thoughts from you as we close today's session. We've obviously discussed so much. So what do you think is next, and what are you looking forward to?
The things that I look forward to the most are, as Professor Liu was talking about, is looking at wellness care, and actually how can we as a society, rather than always looking at things as sick care and how do we do reactionary, is how do we use data and analytics to advance wellness care and being proactive about things. And I think that's the role that data and analytics can really have, is looking at wellness care.
Fantastic. How about you, Professor Liu?
Yeah, thanks. I do echo many of the views that has been shared here. I think in addition to what Praveen has said, I think we are looking very much at digital phenotyping, the ability to analyze information from these devices that then helps us form certain patterns, and working very much with MOHT on some elements of mental health as well as common diseases. But I think my last point perhaps is that I think COVID is not over, but COVID has caused a lot of scars, I think, in our mental, physical isolation, the loss of community, the loss of familiarity, relationship, even the loss of touch. And in some ways, we have given self-determination in favor of public good, greater good, community security. So I think the ground has shifted. We must not see this disruption as one where we use digital tools to transform without sensitivity. I think the post-COVID world could be very dystopic if we are not careful. And so I think we must stick very close to the value proposition, to use technology in the background, not to be intrusive, to return to basics, to reestablish trust and renew self-motivation and activation of the population. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Professor Liu, and thank you to all panelists for sharing your insights today. We've really had such an exciting discussion on the future of healthcare, to discuss the different work Singapore and Australia is leading on remote care, and also how we can best optimize data and AI for healthcare. So I also want to thank our audience members for being so participative today and for joining us this morning. So for those who have actually left your emails, we will pass your questions on and get the panelists to reply you over email. So thank you so much, everyone. And if you have any questions in the meantime, or you would like to know more, please feel free to get in touch with the GovInsider team, and we'll see you next time. Bye.